called Are You Serving All Students? So I think, Rachel, are you going through the objective slide? I couldn't remember. It's the only slide I didn't write the names by. So
same, but I would love to. Yes, I think that was the deal. So first of all, welcome everybody and bravo for joining the last session of the day. You did it. So our objective from this one is that attendees will be able to scrutinize classic measures of school performance to determine if all students are being served. And with that, let's jump right into it, Corey.
That's right. Yeah, that's how this this session is organized. So yeah, there's 4 sections to this. We will talk about data we've looked at in the Excel Center in Indiana for a long time, and then really dive into the deeper ways we've done this, and then talk about how that's gone for us. So the next 2 slides in particular are the district-wide view of how we look at data. And so every term, at the end of the term, Rachel compiles this information out of our student information system. And essentially, we look at 3 major categories. And the ones I think familiar to all the schools across the country. So first, we look at our graduate numbers within the term and throughout the school year. And then in the enrollment section, we have various ways of looking how our enrollment, various ways of counting that enrollment throughout the school year. And then finally, the third section, we look at the way credits have broke down throughout the school year. And so what we use this data for is comparison across the schools. We look at similar size schools to each other, but also year over year to make sure schools are constantly improving and looking at areas for growth. And so really, as we look at this data, we can maybe keep it posted as I ask the question. The first one, we just wanted to ask the group, and we're up to 16 people now, so I think it's safe for folks to just unmute and ask or answer the question, which is this: when you guys look at a term across the country, how do you guys measure the outcomes of a given term? You've seen a brief snapshot of how Central Indiana does it, but how do you guys measure the outcomes of a term?
We use the credits that are earned for that term.
Okay. As I look across, I believe the rest of the attendees are from Indiana. I believe so, except for Georgia, but she'll have some data next year or the year after for us. So, okay. What inside your guys' buildings, how do you guys measure outcomes outside of the regular data review sheet for the network? What are the other ways you guys look at the performance of a term?
In Kokomo, we measure productivity by teacher, class, coach, and then more recently digging into equity data thanks to Rachel, who's awesome. You are too, Corey, but you know.
I don't need any of that. How about you, Katie or Heather, Patrick? How do you guys measure performance at your school?
Yeah, so at UH, we have kind of like the graduate focus stuff, and so that's where Janetta is awesome. And then with the teachers, I try to look at attendance to kind of look at that engagement piece, and then just looking at number of students enrolled versus the number that earned a credit in their class, to try to see if we're really hitting the mark in each class, if there's a particular class that we need to make some do, if we had a lot of people that attended but didn't pass.
Got it.
I look at numbers, enrollment numbers a lot, withdrawal numbers, why the students are being withdrawn, whose caseload they're being withdrawn from the most. I like to track to see what kind of conversations I can do to build my staff in that way. I also try to, especially within this last year, have been really focused when we open our doors to students, what our in-person has been, and if it's more of one caseload than the other, so that we can start bridging that conversation for staff. But other than that, a lot of the graduate numbers, and I like this idea of tracking equity. So Rachel, now I'm gonna have to hit you up since you got thrown under the bus of helping on that.
I would be more than happy to help.
Yeah, I was going to say that is one I think the both of us have put ourselves under several, and we do it with glee. So,
That's true.
and really the question, as Rachel and I built this presentation, we wanted to start with how Indiana typically does it, but know that across the network, the Excel Center really doesn't exist without having really good information to make the changes we do at the furious speed that we do it. And so throughout this, the second question was on the slide, right? Does it capture the performance of all students though, right? As you think about these classic measures of whether at the network or the school level, are you really seeing the performance of all students? And for us, just in the next part of this presentation where we're really getting to why we wanted to present today, several years ago, I had a really good discussion with one of our folks that work in the special education office at the district level. And her concern was we were not serving English language learners at a high level in the network. And at the time we had a student information system that sort of could give you good data, but we could get it out if we really tried hard. And we got this data out. I had previously seen it in the past and knew as a network, ultimately the outcomes were on par with the size of the population of our EL students. And, but the concern still existed. She didn't believe it. Her name was Danielle. She didn't quite believe the data I was showing her. She was like, but it's deeper than that. There are schools that are struggling. And I just kept pointing to the scoreboard, if you will, saying, no, it's just fine, right? Look at the data. But as that concern about outcomes kept growing, right? And back to the rhetorical question from the slide before, are we really serving all students well? We tended to surface a lot of things, right? Now, what I'm going to say now, but I'm going to correct myself later, is in that initial poll, when we looked at all the schools across the state over several years, we were serving EL students as a network very well. So I felt very vindicated 3 years ago, and I remind her every time I talk to Danielle. So, but it did recognize the need to go deeper. And so what Rachel's going to go through in the next several slides is the way we've constructed our data to do just that. And so I'll turn it over to Rachel after I steamrolled one of her slides already and just go on mute for a little bit. So.
Thank you, Corey. Yeah, so as we take a deeper look here, we decided that the groups or categories to use would be special populations, so focusing specifically on students with an IEP, a 504 plan, or those that identified as language minority students. And then race obviously broke down into white, Black, Hispanic, multiracial, and Asian. And then our ages, we broke those into 16 to 18-year-olds, then those 19 to 25-year-olds, or 24-year-olds, and then 25 and up group. And then a more recent addition was sex, because we found, right, that results would also vary based on male or female. So those are our categories, and that moves us into the domains. So we focused on credits earned, productive students, graduates, withdrawals, and no-shows. And those domains have definitely provided some interesting results. Any questions on the categories or domains? So then when you put it all together, we get our schools versus our network, right? So we wanted to talk not just about what we're doing at a network level, because sometimes, right, one school is really strong in one area and that can kind of cover at the network level for the other schools that might not be. So we went ahead and pulled this for you all. And then Corey, were we going to share the link so everyone else could kind of pop it up on their screen, right? Okay. Here you go, folks.
I put it in the chat.
Oh, thanks, Corey.
Yep.
Okay, and then if I remember correctly, Corey's going to talk through the rest of this with y'all. Yes, I just said y'all.
Yeah, so what this sheet shows is we have the network, the real data for the network in terms 1 through 3 of this school year, and compared to the data from last year, terms 1 through 3. So this data was important to us from a couple standpoints. This is true pre-COVID 1 through 3 of last year, and true during COVID 1 through 3 of this year. Comparing school year to school year, both school years were impacted by COVID. And so this was a really good measure of how the terms looked year over year. And so one of the things as you guys have the link to, you guys can jump in and really dive in as you'd like. But what we tried to attempt to do here is compare the enrolled number of students in each of these categories or subgroups as a proportion of their enrollment, right? And so as you see in the first box, as a network in 2021, we enrolled 520 students with IEPs, which was 9% of the total enrollment last school year. And then as you see that underneath, right, we start breaking down the various domains that Rachel talked about, right? And so of the credits earned, students with IEPs earned 1,600 credits, which was 8.4% of the credits earned, which is a negative gap of 0.5%, right? Which shows that pretty close, we're on par with earning the credits as a proportion of their population to the network, right? Rachel and I think year over year, we question whether or not these categories are what we should be doing or what we should be using, but at the same time, we can't bring ourselves to use classic achievement gap language, right? To find some dominant category or some main normal to compare against, because we want to really just look at these populations as subsets of themselves, right? And so if you're 10% of the population, you should be 10% of the grads, 10% of the credits, 10% of the withdrawals, 10% of the no-shows. And the color system that you're seeing here is any gap that's positive is green, pure and simple. 0 and above is green. Any gap that is negative, but within 5% of the proportion size or the population size, we code it as yellow. And then anything further away from the proportion of the population turns red. This is something we don't have a research article driving this. We don't have sort of a state assessment framework that we're using that are driving these colors. These are just what we are using. And the traditional schools around us often are dealing with 15, 20, 25% gaps among populations when it comes to standardized tests and other measures. So we feel pretty good about this, the high standard that we've set here. But I think as you guys have, I want to give maybe a little bit, because I think we are moving rather quickly through the presentation in some ways, but what I want you guys to do is just scroll through these, ask questions if you need, but really be thinking about, is this work that you have been doing or something similar to it, and in what ways, and what are you seeing? And if you haven't, to look at this data in this way, what do you think you'd see, right? And what guesses about where you may be underserving students might pop up. And it's important in the language you choose here, because it's very easy to put this language on students, right? Students are not graduating at a high level. Students aren't earning the credits. We choose to put that onus on us, right? We are underserving students with yellow and red gaps across the board. And so as you guys have opened that sheet up, again, the link is in the chat. I don't think anyone has joined since we dropped the link. Feel free to ask questions for 1, 2, if you're ready to talk about, yeah, we've done some of this work and this is what we see when we do the work. And if you haven't, we'd like just a nice discussion over the next 10, 15 minutes about what you might see. We've also put a school example on the Kokomo tab. We used one of our schools to the north of the network as an example of the school level version of the network. So.
I love that you guys pull this information, and I know you've sent it out in emails before. And Corey, I know you are familiar with me saying that data is not my friend. And so I'm constantly seeing it. I'm intrigued with it. But how do you specifically serve one area over another so that we can build up these yellow and red areas. It's obvious that specific areas need us to put a little forth more effort, but what does that look like, I guess? And what have you guys seen from your experience as you've moved up through the Excel Center?
Yeah, we have a couple slides later that talk about some of the things that have come up, right? That is where one of the places we do want to end this presentation. But I think to your question about how do you choose where to go? How do you choose to focus on one area over others? I think just from my standpoint, and then I can also give it over to Rachel. And there are some school leaders on here also that have used this data and might have similar or contrasting reflections. But for me, honestly, where this is and how I approach it, it is simply a reflection point about, is this something that is predictable and we're doing something, we just need to wait more time to see the fruits of that labor? Or is this sort of a blind spot, right? I remember specifically running this data, and we pushed it out in August, and we had a director completely blown away by one of the subpopulations no-showing after our orientations. Just absolutely blown away that they would have not predicted that group be the one to not show up after orientation. It was like plus 10% of their category size. And it led them to think very critically about the orientation. Not about 1924s, but what about our orientation can make sure all students come back, but we should see some movement here as well. And we had a lot of reactions from directors across the network go right to their orientation for change. So honestly, I think to start at the school level, it is are we seeing blind spots? Is this something we need to focus more on and pull PD in or get more data on? And then what are the things that we can leverage to make it happen? And we're doing the same thing at a network level.
Because I think, I'll wait.
Well, and to kind of build off of what Katie was saying, so when we looked at the data at UH, we were thinking it was going to come back that our SPED population and our ELL population were going to be lower performing, and it was the complete opposite. Our SPED population and our ELL population are way outperforming on average our native English speaking students. And as we started kind of talking as an admin team, and we were like, what is missing for our native English speakers? And it was like that support system. Our EL population, they have Sharon, they have an EL coordinator. Our paraprofessional is from the same country and speaks the same language as most of our EL students. And then our SPED students specifically have our TOR, but then the rest of our students, like, yeah, they have our staff, but there's not like a person that they have. And so we've kind of hit upon maybe that's the issue, is there's not like a person specifically assigned to this population of students. And so what are they missing out on by not having just like a person specifically assigned to them to be their support? And so that's what we've been looking at, kind of thinking of what we can do next school year to get more support, because our students that have all these official titled people to support them, that's who's performing the best.
Interesting.
Sorry, my husband got home and so the dogs went crazy, but I was asking, so for us, we've specifically seen that females have outperformed males. We're not.
If anyone doesn't know, Katie's dog Wrigley is a hyperactive, kind of a jerk, but he's sweet.
I just don't think he liked the data she was talking about. So.
Probably because he's like, she doesn't even know data. But so that we had seen earlier today in one of the presentations that between our females between 28 and 34 did best over virtual learning. And typically, even outside of virtual learning, we've seen that females outperform our males. So I guess I just want a problem solving thing because I'm a fixer. So I want to know why and how can we reach our males so that we can have that same trajectory for them to see that improvement.
It's a great question. I mean, Rachel and I's hope is this data forces those questions. So, I mean, we could go into probably 3 hours of the psychology, the sociology of everything that you just described, right?
That's what I want. Let's do that. Not 3 hours of it. If you can condense it into like the next 30 minutes.
I mean, we can go on a long time just about that. And at the network level, when you look at that network tab that we shared, you know, the reason we originally never pulled sex, and the reason is it was a binary, right? It was either you were male or female, and the way the data was put into the system. But like, if there's a gap, it's going to be positively reflected on one side and only negatively on the other side, where there was multiple sort of categories for the others. But to that point, at the network level, males are all yellow, right? And so they are behind, but it's not like they crept into to more than 5%. Now, if we break that down by location, right, and you have Decatur specific data, you might see that more pronounced. Possibly, which is why it's important for us as a big network in Indiana to not only disaggregate by population, but by school, right? Because as Heather said, right, as a network, we might be screaming alarm bells for special ed students, but Heather's sitting there like, that's not us, right? And so, but the question that raises right after that reflection is what we're hoping for. Good. Anybody else who's done this work or has not done this work, you know, what are you seeing or think you'd see?
Well, actually, you know, I like data and I usually have plenty of time to like play around with stuff, but I'm interested really just to hear what everybody thinks about it. And more specifically, like towards like the coaching role, because like I've spent a lot of time thinking about productivity and like being the lead teacher. And now that I'm the lead coach, like I'm really interested to hear like thoughts on like caseload stuff and what you're tracking most, like the withdrawal thing she was talking about, Katie was talking about earlier. Like those are the things that I'm interested in knowing what other people are tracking. And equity is definitely something I haven't really spent a lot of time on. So I'm interested to hear how everybody else uses it.
Yeah, well, that question could be for the floor.
This is something that we've been kind of looking at all school year with the view of equity and looking at segmenting specific populations in our school. And, you know, I think we had a conversation about how useful this was going to be and kind of how we thought that the data was going to look before we ever received it. And then we had a meeting once we received it and we actually looked over it and how you know, what we actually thought the data was going to look like. We were surprised by it. We were shocked by it, especially with some of our younger students and some of our Black and Brown students. When we were looking at that, you know, it was kind of shocking. And I think our immediate thought was, oh my gosh, we are in some way not serving these students, right? We're not serving these students adequately. We're not serving these students like we are serving other students, whether that was purposeful or unpurposeful. That's kind of what the data showed. And so we, as a school, really thought about how we could change purposeful things that we could do to change that this school year. And one of the biggest things that we did was our orientation. That was probably one of the biggest things Clarksville did right at the start of the school year was, okay, we need to completely reframe this. If we have this population of students that don't feel like maybe we're connecting with them, maybe they they're leaving with more questions, or they don't feel how we could possibly serve them specifically. So we had to reframe our orientation, and since then we've focused on staff involvement, full staff participation in orientation so that they can meet all of us. We've focused on specific areas of improvement, not only, going through the kind of the black and white stuff, like, okay, it's 40 credits, it's these classes, but focusing on a social emotional side too, and incorporating that into our incorporating SEL into our orientation. And since then, we've had a lot of meaningful conversations, meaningful discussions that start at orientation. The relationship is starting at orientation and it's blossoming from there. And we have really seen an improvement in our no-show data specifically. And so I think that that's just one area that we've really used this as a benefit.
Very good. Thank you, Patrick.
I think for Kokomo, because we struggle so much with 19 to 24 and some students of color, is to really be honest with them and say, this is what the data is showing, and we want to know. We want to know what, if you're feeling like this is too much, or you're feeling like you don't feel connected to this program, what can we do to help address that before you actually quit? Yeah, I think that's going to be our next focus, is just really being transparent with our students as they come in and say, look, we want to hear what we're doing wrong, not just have you disappear.
Mm-hmm.
I do have a quick question. So just taking a look at this at first blush, but Corey and team, have you seen any trends based on time of year when it comes to your no-shows?
Term 3, at least the way it used to be structured, because it was Thanksgiving break and winter break. And a lot of our students, being adult learners, the holiday jobs are available and you can make more money. And so they go to UPS, they go to the mall or wherever. And so that, I think, kind of across the board, I see people shaking their head, yes, about term 3 had traditionally been a struggle.
I would say the same thing. We have a large population of ELL students, and they will go home during the holidays, during that T3 time, the holiday time. We always see some of our Hispanic students that maybe will go through orientation, attend a couple weeks, and then the holiday season, of course, and then they go back home to spend time with their loved ones and stuff. So that's kind of the trend that we typically see too, is T3.
Yeah. In Georgia, for context, our term 3 would start just after Halloween, start of November. It'd have a 3-day break for Thanksgiving, a 2-week break for winter break, and then Martin Luther King Day off before the term would be over in January. On top of weather, on top of holiday and seasonal shopping and seasonal work. And we've since restructured that term, I think, in response to some of this data as well. So.
Yeah, I'm curious to hear even more about how you've had to restructure. I can anticipate that will be a challenge here in Arizona. We have a lot of temporary holiday work that does take place. Amazon half owns us. So, with that being the case, even if you work in just even the social service world, or even just on our Goodwill side of things, we tend to see that tend to drop off during that time of year, because somehow we believe this temporary money is permanent and that somehow Amazon's going to keep me, and it's not going to happen. So yeah, I was really curious to see if you're seeing any trends that way with actual time of year and just maybe thinking through retention strategies to keep people motivated through that time period. So
Yeah.
thank you.
Yeah, and there's, every term has challenges to it, right? Term 3, I think, is one of the most intense because it's a culmination of previously a prolonged term plus winter weather plus holiday, right? But as soon as it starts warming up, those seasonal jobs then begin. I don't know how many students I would lose to just working the 4-H fair for three weeks for the state fair. They just disappear and then come back like, where am I at? Can I finish the class? It's like, no. Yeah, each term has its own, because as soon as it starts warming up, some students are just like, oh, I can go back outside. I won't be back. It's an interesting thing.
I guess one more question I did have for you with that. Oh, sorry, Heather. I'm so sorry. Did you want to go ahead?
Sorry. I was going to say, are you in Arizona? Is that correct?
Yes.
Getting ready to open? Yeah.
Mhm.
So another thing to kind of keep in mind with that when you're planning and strategizing is the start of the school year and the end of the school year, because we tend to start a little earlier and go a little later than the traditional schools. Your parents are going to be more concerned about their own children's schooling, and so they'll disconnect at the start and the end of the year. And then your younger students who are like, well, my friends aren't in school right now, will also tend to do that disconnect. So like Corey said, each term kind of has its own challenges that you're constantly thinking like what's going to be the best strategy for this one.
I hear you, because I'm really concerned a little bit about the our final term, because we've had to restructure our term schedule just to meet Arizona credit requirements, which are really silly, but we're going to get there. Because our students, like you said, they start in August. Everyone here will start in August, and school children will be out May-ish, early June-ish, and we're kind of being pushed to keep our calendar into the end of June. So I can anticipate that last few weeks of school is going to be a lot of senioritis and a lot of chasing folks.
Yeah, and we actually we're making a bet with a brand new calendar here in Indiana. I think we talked a little bit when you were in a couple weeks ago of, it's really hard to engage students in July sometimes because their kids aren't in school. It's the midsummer. And so what we've done is push the start date up to the start of August with the bet that it will be easier to keep students who are close in June than it is to re-engage a bunch of students after a summer before their kids go back. And so we're taking a bit of a leap here, but we think it's a better calendar overall.
Any playing around with time of year that you offer certain types of classes so they don't, let's say, bomb all of their math and English requirements in term 3 because nobody's, folks are going to fall out. Any playing around with things like that?
Interesting. Yeah, do you guys want to share? Does the season of the year impact your offerings?
We still go with what the majority will need. We pray they don't fall off, but we start the term with the planned out schedule for what our enrolled students need. And then we fight like hell to keep them.
Yeah.
In previous years, we've done, there's like a 2-week group of students who we need to re-engage like after Christmas. There have been a couple of times where we re-engage with an elective to try to like boost morale a little bit. So we did like art. There was like a creative thinking class that they got like a media credit for, but like we tried to do just like a re-engagement course to pull somebody in, even though it was just an elective. During the winter, those like 2 weeks are really hard to like pull somebody in for or like get them to do much. So those electives we had a lot of fun, and I had probably like 16 students in one of my art classes, and it was a great opportunity for teachers to just like take a breather and re-engage and be productive.
Yeah.
Thank you. Lots of wisdom in this room.
Yeah. Next time Georgia's in Indiana, I need to make sure she sees as many of you all as possible.
I would love that.
Yeah.
And wherever that place is we went for lunch.
One thing that we've seen at our school. Oh, so sorry, Corey.
No, she mentioned lunch, which is always going to get my attention. Had it again today, Georgia, to be honest. So, sorry, Patrick.
No, you're fine. Well, I mean, whenever you come down to Clarksville, it's always donuts. So we'll take donuts anytime.
That's right. Donuts and barbecue, sir. Every
That's
time.
right.
Clarksville is in Texas?
Clarksville, Indiana.
Oh my goodness, there's barbecue there too? Awesome.
One thing that we not only see is, depending on when public schools are in versus when we're in and out, is that it also impacts our childcare offerings. So we have whenever traditional public school is out, we tend to see an increase of students bringing their children into the YLCC, the Young Learners Child Care Center. So that's always something that we have to prepare for too, is thinking about the traditional public school calendar and how that's going to impact our calendar.
Very good.
Wow, I could totally see that going either way, like other students not coming because their kids are off, or them dragging them into school and just being too full.
It really does. It works both ways. We have a population of students where we have to really contact and hound to get re-engaged. And the opposite, we have our students that are always there, our perfect attendance students that have school-aged children. And then our YLCC is inundated with all of these school-aged children for the week of spring break or something like that.
Has anybody ever had the experience of your childcare being too full? And what do you do with your students when that happens? Oh, a lot of head nodding.
I've gotten puked on before in a really nice dress, and I learned not to wear nice clothes to work anymore.
Certainly not in the first 2 weeks when that YLCC can be full. So
yeah, we tend to help out in the YLCC whenever we're needed. If you're free, or if you don't have meetings at that time and the YLCC is really inundated, well, you just head on in there and see what they need.
Yep.
We do a lot of pulling on wearing many hats, filling where needed. And then if it does become where there's not enough staff to support, we will send older children who don't need much entertaining. We can give them a coloring book and some crayons, and we'll have them, if they're non-disruptive, go sit in class with their parent or family. Well, it would be a parent. So that way we can open up more space for the children that may or may not be more disruptive or are younger.
That's a neat accommodation.
Yep. Well, with about 10 minutes left, I just want to thank all of you for that discussion. That is exactly what Rachel and I were hoping for. And it's exactly what looking at data leads to, right? It's easy to sit there without information and just start making sort of these claims about reality, right? And then you're confronted with an attempt at an objective way to look at that reality, and you're often confronted with questioning your assumptions, and typically leads to positive things, particularly when it's in a safe environment and not used as a weapon, right? Which I think people are leery of, particularly with in education. So what we do want to spend the last 9 minutes we've got here before we close out today is some of the impact this has had on our network. And so first and foremost, the anecdote I said earlier, I talked about earlier, where I was arguing with Danielle about our English language learners and their success in the network. When we pulled that data and looked as a network, we were fine. We were green across the board. But what we found is when we disaggregated by school, however, schools like Heather's and schools like Brooks, our hosts for this session, they were doing so well in their two buildings with the largest populations of ELL students in the network that it overshadowed several schools who were struggling, because those two buildings in particular, 45 to 55% of their building is ELL, and they do an amazing job. And that success was overshadowing schools like Clarksville and others who had 15 to 20%, and we're underserving in some ways, right? And so it allowed us to build this tiered support doc. Rachel, can you click on that, will it? I believe we linked it. Yes. And so what it allowed us to do is separate those tiers out, right? And so West and University Heights were absolutely crushing their data. But we made sure we built a system around that that said if you have that high of a population, more than 40% of your students are EL, you have to dedicate a staff member to half day to directly support and servicing those students. And if you're in this 20 to 40% range, you get a choice. You either give somebody half a day or you pay someone $3,000 to make sure these students are supported and staff have the tools they need. And then when you get down to 5 to 20%, it's a $1,500 stipend on top of on someone's full day. And then folks with less than 5% who are actually pretty green across the board as well. These very small populations hardly show any gaps. It's these schools in the middle in the yellow and green. You know, we just asked the lead teacher take on those responsibilities. And so in the year-over-year data in the EL section, or in the language learner section, which is at the top, we had 4 of 5 categories last year as a network were green, and this year we're actually all 5 of 5 are green. And again, that's at a network level. As you break it down by school, some schools still have some work to do, but we made strong data stronger, I think, in just 3 months of work with this tiered system. And so the other supports we've done are about to do. We're about to launch a diversity, equity, and inclusion committee. We've been working with the larger Goodwill as they launch their own committees, and we're in the middle of audits with a local organization. And we look to get an email out to all staff and just get a sense of interest and start planning what that work looks like in the next school year to support school leaders. And that will dovetail some of the challenges Rachel will talk about in our last slide. And then, as you heard across the discussion today, there were lots and lots of local school efforts to retool orientations. There were book studies across the network on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And a lot of the professional developments our staffs have gone through showed up today in this conference around anti-racism, implicit bias, social emotional learning, mental health. A lot of those things showed up in the conference, and a lot of it, I think, are offshoots of some of the work that we're seeing come from this equity data. But this is not without challenges, and that's Rachel will bring us home on challenges, because that's where I think her and I work most. It's like, what are we unhappy with? So.
Yeah, thanks, Corey. So yeah, we wanted to make sure that you all knew not just like the data is out there, but also here's how it's being used, and then also some of the challenges that come with it, because it's not been easy. But the one challenge, right, capacity for buildings to incorporate without district support. So looking at what availability you all have within your buildings, and if you're able to do that without a bunch of support from the district. And then quantity of data is of course immense. It's a lot of information for a lot of schools. And so I can't help myself. I got to show you guys this if I still have it open somewhere.
Yeah, you saw the clean version of a clean version, but Rachel's got.
So, and this is even like a clean version of it, but you can see, right? Like I just keep scrolling. I'm not even sure how many rows and columns of all of this data. And this is the standard layout too. So it's just a lot of data to try to put together and then also make it digestible. Because at the end of the day, we want to track the data, but make it useful, or else, you know, what's the point? So it's definitely a lot of information to try and put together for everybody. And then lastly, a need for professional development. So I think, was it Katie, you said, right, you're not a data person. So at the end of the day, there's some professional development that needs to be done in an effort to help people use what's available, and hopefully, you know, limit the time you all have to spend looking through the data and figuring out what to do with it. So those are some of the challenges that come with it. Did I miss anything, Corey?
No, I think you nailed it. And we started with how we've been reviewing our data all 10 years I've been at Goodwill. And it's around classic measures of enrollment and credits and graduates. And typically we can send that data out to almost any staff member in the network, and they could pretty quickly break it down like a stat sheet after a basketball game. Like, all right, we were up here, we were down here, this is what we could do. And I think we overestimated our ability to do that same work with the equity data, right? We thought that awareness and that sort of push out, everyone will take it, run immediately, start writing challenges. And what we found is exactly what Rachel just described, where we need to take a lot more time to describe what's in it, how we got there, how to build lead measures to do it, and build bigger frameworks around racial equity and implicit bias and DEI to understand it and put it into practice. So that is it. We've got about 2 minutes left for questions or any final thoughts. Patrick?
Corey, I would just like to say that one of my favorite moments of this school year was when we heard from Dr. Kendi earlier this year. And we talked about anti-racism. And then we also got looking at the equity data too. And we also saw then, the need for us to maybe re-examine how we're serving certain populations of students, and if there could be some implicit bias in there, and how we could better serve our students. And so I think that was not only challenging for us as a school to look at, because we need to then think about, we need to challenge ourselves in thinking, how are we actually serving these students? Is there something that we're doing that is disproportionately serving one population versus another? And I would just like to, any PD, any professional development that we could further that conversation on, I would strongly support, because that is definitely an area that I think all of us at Clarksville, all of us at our school, has continued that conversation on systemic injustices that we've seen. I think that's kind of been a theme of this whole past year, right? Is like identifying systemic injustice. And it's in every system, really, education and education in public schools as well. So how can we identify that and kind of root that out? Yeah. So any PDs on that, I would be very excited about.
Appreciate that, Patrick. And I think that's a good spot to end too, because I think Dr. Kendi's work does a great job of making this not about people, right? Like, people are imbued with those biases and prejudices, and as much work as we can do with that, I think, and we should, right? But that is just a piece of it. What I found most profound about Dr. Kendi's work is that work goes into policy, and what policies need to be taken apart that do favor others over some. And then once you have identified those and not change those, that is what he would refer to as racist policy then. And that I think is a fantastic call for us, is find the policies and the systems, because my response to you, Patrick, is even though there are systemic issues, right, around racism, sexism, et cetera, within the system, for us, we are the system. We are the institution. And so to say, oh, this is just systemic, right? No, we're the system here. And we are in charge of every one of the policies we implement, because that's the culture we have here. We build them together, we draft them out, we send them out for comment every single time. And so that's the work we've got to do. And that's one of the things we'll be looking at all summer. So thank you, Patrick. Great place to end. All right. Well, I think we have one last closing session for about 10 minutes, and then it's good time for a weekend. So thank you all. It was great to see you, Georgia. Great to see you, Carla.